All right, welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm super excited to host this one with Dr. Todd McGowan. It will be the second time Dr. Todd McGowan and I have spoken. We first had a conversation about 2 years ago now on his book, Emancipation After Hegel. I'll leave a link in the description for that if you're interested in learning about that work and seeing sort of the history of our conversation. And today, this conversation is primarily going to be focused on a book that I'm not sure how much attention it's got yet, but the Racist Fantasy, which was published at the end of 2022. So thanks for coming on, Dr. McGowan, and nice to see you again. Nice to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me, but let's do Todd. Okay, Dr. McGowan.
Okay, no Dr. McGowan.
It kind of weirds me out.
That's okay. Yeah. I've had similar reactions sometimes after after getting the doctorate. Anyway, it's just a formality. Yeah. Okay, Todd. So you've had since we last spoke. I mean, let's just take it slow and do I'd like to do a little bit more background on the direction and the development of your thinking since we last spoke. So for those of you who are not familiar with your work or who are just getting into your work, can you connect Emancipation After Hegel to the logic of the books you've been writing in the last 2 or 3 years? You've got Universality and Identity Politics, Enjoyment, Right and Left, and then the Racist Fantasy. Is there a theme that connects this?
Is there a theme? Yeah, I think there is. So I think that the thing that connects all of them is this idea of universality, which when I was doing the book on Hegel, that really was the thing that I kept coming back to, that one of the things that really separates Hegel from my, presupposition, my analysis is that we live in a very particularist time. And so people advance a particularist claim. Like one of the ways that one of the piece of evidence for this is the way people will say, well, this is my truth, right? This is my truth. So it's a very particularist. So no one could say, well, that's not true. The person would say, no, that's my truth. So you can't. So I see that as a very particularist envelope in which we're thinking. And that's one of the things that Hegel attacks from the beginning of the phenomenology to the end of his thinking. So that got me, I think, on that hobby horse, I guess. And then I continued to ride it through. And then the Universality book, one of the things that the Hegel book was very specifically on Hegel. I thought it had some other implications, but I didn't imagine that would have a larger audience. And so I wrote the Universality book as a way to take that universality idea and also to say what I thought universality was in a way that was distinct from Hegel. So in that sense, it's a little development on different. And then that led me to write the book on racism. And to be honest, the racism one, there've been some books on psychoanalysis and racism, like Fanon would be the main figure probably. And there've been some more recently, but I noticed a lacuna, and people hadn't talked about the way fantasy worked with racism. And so I just felt like that was a book that had to be written, and I thought someone should write it, and then I thought maybe I should just write it in case no one else does. And then the Enjoyment, Right and Left again came out of this universality which I aligned with leftism and particularity with the right. And so again, that just kind of followed from the same thing. So there is a real, you're right to say there's a kind of through line between them. I didn't think about that when I was doing them. I just said, I tend to work on books a lot at the same time. Like right now, I probably have 5 or 6 books that are in some stage of being done or not. So one is all the way done, but it's the worst one. So it's probably never going to be. I have books that never get published too. So this one I sent to a friend. He's like, yeah, I think this one maybe you should never publish. So, but maybe I'll rework it. I don't know. So I that's sort of my practice. And so these were all germinating even when I was working on the Hegel book.
Right on. I mean, I think maybe all writers have a couple files somewhere of work that will never see the light of day. I remember when I was first getting into evolutionary biology, I remember this analogy that Richard Dawkins used with junk DNA and writing, that a lot of DNA that's coded is actually junk. It never codes for any observable external manifestation of anything. So I think all writers in some sense have a bunch of, in this analogy, some junk DNA floating around.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah. So this dimension of universality and particularity, some people might not be too familiar with this line that runs through Hegel. I'm currently teaching the science of logic, and there's this emphasis that Hegel makes on universality, particularity, singularity.
Yeah.
How does this seems to be very relevant to this line of this series of books that you've been putting out, because singularity might be something related to enjoyment or something like that, or so in this relationship between universality and particularity, and like sort of particularity being like sort of this era of my truth, how do you understand this, and how is this working politically in your view?
Yeah, so your particularity is politically, I would say your particularity is what you're just born into, right? Like the identity that you're born into, or that you that's given to you in some way. And then what universality does is it's the background for everything, but it's also what allows you to distance yourself from your particular situation. So I'm born, let's say, in the American Midwest. I grew up with all the different values inherent in that, for better or worse, in that situation. But then, because I have some contact with the universal, with what's not tied to that particular situation, that allows me to become singular. So my way of thinking of it is that universality is what distances us from our particularity, and then that distance that we take up is what makes us singular. So we're not singular because of any part of our identity. We're singular, or all our identities brought together. We're singular in the way that we're in the certain way that we're alienated from our identity. So for me, alienation is not a bad thing. Alienation is the way in which we find our singularity. So that's how I would think of the relationship between those three terms, related to Hegel, but not exactly Hegelian. But Hegel is very much the phenomenology begins, as you know, with a real praise of the way universe, like people try to say particular things, and Hegel would say, well, you're not really saying something particular, you're actually saying something universal when you are trying to say something particular. So I think it's really central to his project, this identifying the way universality is at work in what seems like it's particular.
Right. I think the relationship between the two is fundamental. And I also agree with sort of this idea that, alienation kind of gets a bad name in some sense, because it can also be a source of enjoyment and positivity in many ways. And like you're saying, sort of this tendency to singularity.
Well, I would just say for Hegel, alienation is only a good thing. Like he never, like the German word that he most often uses is Entfremdung. He also uses Entäußerung, which is that Marx uses both words as well, but they're only positive for him. They're simply never negative. So it is interesting that I think with Marx, it all flips around, and then alienation becomes a terrible thing, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a point that doesn't get discussed too much. Would you be willing to go into, like the common line that I've always heard when I was reading the history of philosophy in the 20th century is, Marx turns Hegel on his head and stuff like this. How does that work with the concept of alienation? And what would be it seems to me like the political consequences of Marxist alienation versus probably a lesser known Hegelian alienation is a big difference, like for political.
I think it's a big difference. Yeah. So I think that famous line, I think it comes from a preface to Capital. It's not, you think it's such a central thing, but it's not actually in a book where he says, with Hegel, the dialectic is standing on its head, and I'm going to turn him right side up. And I like to say that I actually work on a little book on alienation, and I said, well, Hegel thinks better when he's standing on his head, So I think but I like that idea that like if you've ever stood on your head, you see things differently, right? Like you don't just see the stereotypical way that things are. And I think there's something that in a way, that's what dialectics is for Hegel. It's like all of a sudden we're going to look at things in a different way and see things that we otherwise wouldn't see. And that's what I think for him alienation is. So alienation is freeing from the particular situation or conditions that we are stuck in, that are given to us. And so he very much wants to see how we can get out of like what's the trap of what's given to us, and alienation is the way we do that. Now, for Marx, it's interesting because he identifies capitalism with the alienation of the worker from the worker's product, right? So that and obviously Hegel's not talking about that, but I would just say I'm not sure that alienation is really what's problematic about capitalism. Like I think I've worked several jobs where I've been totally alienated from my product, and I was able to just put in my headphones and listen to French podcast or whatever I did. I don't have a podcast at the time, but and that was pretty great. So I don't think necessarily being alienated from your product is such a bad thing, right? Like imagine how much it must suck if you're a feudal artisan who all your life is like working as a blacksmith and you're all you are as the product. I don't think that's better. I think alienation is pretty great. So even in the sense of, I think the way capitalism damages and controls us is that it proffers an end to alienation. It says, look, if you get enough commodities, or if you get the right commodity, you can escape alienation altogether. And so to me, that's how I would see the problem. I mean, this is the exact thesis of my book that's upcoming sometime. The one that didn't get thrown away anyway.
Oh man, there's so many threads there. I just want to say, I remember in my early 30s, I was doing these like little spiritual little practices and techniques, and one of them is this this practice where you like meditate and breathe when you're like standing on your head, like you're on you use your shoulders, but you like, the point is to let all the blood rush to your head for like 2 minutes or 3 minutes or something like that, and has a weird effect to your to your consciousness, and obviously because we spend our whole lives walking upright, right? So the blood flow is always in a certain direction, but Hegel is kind of like this. I think that it's kind of like a philosophical standing on your head.
Absolutely, no, it's absolutely
flips everything upside down.
I know, it's interesting that Marx was trying to insult him, but he kind of got him right, I think, in that description. Yeah,
it's a nice point. Yeah, and huge potential political consequences. I just want to make the quick point, maybe get your opinion on the way in which this next book you're writing, the capitalist fantasy as ending alienation, that seems to fit into. Now there might be another thread in your books here, because the thesis of the racist fantasy is the role of obstacle in the fantasy. And am I correct saying that you're saying the capitalist fantasy is ending alienation could be like its own obstacle?
Right, that's its own obstacle, but the fantasy is getting rid of the obstacle, right? Like that's the interest. But you're right that capitalism requires the obstacle,
but it can't get rid of it.
Can't ever get rid of it. But what spurs production on is precisely, and consumption is precisely this idea that eventually I'll get beyond the obstacle. And if you didn't think that, then imagine what the effect of that would have on the process of consumption and production. Exactly. It would really retard it, I think. Like it would really slow it down. So I think that's why capitalism requires that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, reflecting on sort of my own relationship to capitalism, I remember as a teen, like getting hooked up with like the new hat or a new jersey or a new, whatever it was that was keeping me going to the mall or something like that. And then just going into sort of like a minimalist sort of attitude, because then you just subtract the commodity. Like you just, instead of the commodity is going to, that commodity is going to work or something, you just subtract yourself from the field of commodities.
Yeah. Exactly right. It's exactly right. Yeah.
All right. So there's this subtractive effort, and maybe that will come up later. But all right. So in these, you got this series of books one more question I wanted to ask before going into the racist fantasy is, with your thesis of universality and particularity, do you think that contemporary identity politics is an example of clinging to particular identity? And if so,
Absolutely.
how does that fit into your theory?
No, it absolutely is. I mean, any time. I think identity is always particular, right? Like you can't have an identity that's not particular. And I think, and this is a thing I work out in the Enjoyment, Right, and Left book, I think you can't have an identity that doesn't have an enemy attached to it, because that's how you know you have the identity, right? Like there's no way, no identity is formed without this outsider who doesn't have the identity. So I think it's absolutely true that identity is tied to particularity, and the particularity needs other particularities to define itself.
Right. Okay. All right. So, that just making me think, because, that famous formulation by Hegel on identity, where identity is the identity of identity and difference.
Yeah.
So it's like, what would that, maybe that's the one final question. What would that look like politically in your?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty radical political program, right? Like, and I think that has nothing to do with how people conceive identity politics, right? Because Hegel's identity, and you might say that his formula is the problem with identity politics, right? Because he's saying that you want to grasp your identity, but it's only through losing it that you actually discover what it is. So I think that's the key thing, right? Like that you would, and just to be clear, I think that identity politics is basically a right-wing strategy, I think, and it's about how do I secure that identity, right? And so Hegel would say, well, the whole point of identity is the identity of identity and difference. This great formulation, a little unwieldy, but then you can't ever secure it. You can't secure it, right? There's no way to secure it, because the only way you discover it is through its being lost, right? So I think that's crucial, and it would totally, I mean, obviously it would change international politics, but it would also change every kind of political wager, I would think, because you would have to, I mean, it forces you, if you think like that, it forces you onto the terrain of universal, right? Like, I think that, we have certain examples in history where that was really, really tried. Like Haiti, I think that was really tried for a little bit. France, I think it was really tried for a little bit. And then those projects ended up blowing up. So I think that it ended up turning into empires, really. So, which is the opposite. Like empire is the attempt to create an identity that's secure, right? So it's not that Hegelian idea. So I don't know. I think that that's what the transformative effect on politics would be. I think again, it would just put you on the terrain of universality immediately, right? Like you couldn't be just defending your particular interest, because that you would realize that it's only found through with what's other or what's different from it.
Okay, so let's see here. I mean, I just wanted to make one more point here. I think this is an important topic. With your idea that identity politics is rightist, would that mean that leftist identity politics is a reaction to rightist identity politics, or that it's pseudo-leftist, or what's going on?
I don't think it exists. I just don't think there's such a thing. I don't think there's such thing as leftist identity politics. But I think things that get accused of it often are not really identity politics, right? Like, so I talk about this in the book, like Black Lives Matter. I don't think it was identity politics. It was an anti-racist movement. But then the attack on it was often, oh, this is identity politics. But it was never identity politics, because it wasn't like, identity politics would be something like, we need more, if Black Lives Matter said this, we need more Black representation in the police, right? Well, that wasn't the point. The point was, we need to eliminate racist policing, right? So, and we were just recently got proof, if we ever needed it, that it didn't matter, that the racial composition of the police force doesn't affect racist violence, right? Like it doesn't have a panacea for it. So I think my claim would be there's no such thing as leftist identity politics. So you said pseudo, yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, it's just if they're, and I think it's interesting, if for people that are at a university, there's a lot of that. Like there's a lot of like, and it's become a huge industry. This diversity and equity industry, it's a huge industry.
Yeah,
and it's completely based around identity politics, and it's completely anti-universalist. And it's interesting because I teach here at University of Vermont, and there was a huge during the Black Lives Matter movement, maybe a little before, there was a huge effort among students and it was called Students for Justice or something. No, it was called No Names for Justice. So it was the students it was all an anonymous kind of movement, nameless movement. It's No Names for Justice. And they had certain demands they made to the administration to take up a more anti-racist position. And the response to the administration was, we're going to hire some firm to create, I'm sure they didn't create it, they had it already, a little test that everybody had to take, all students, all professors, once a year, to prove that they'll pass this diversity. And the test was ridiculous, right? Like it was ridiculous. It was basically pure, like just diversity train, like the kind of thing, and never, and what was avoided was any addressing of structural racism, which is the thing, right? Like that's what the students were upset about. They were upset about, they didn't want every student to have this corporatized test that they had to go through. So I think it's really, the way in which it gets, and I think a lot of not just universities, a lot of corporations do this as well. And I think those are ways in which people would say, oh, well, that's kind of leftist identity politics. I don't think that's leftist at all. I do think it's identity politics, but I don't think it's leftist at all.
Okay. So, I think this let's see, this idea of, let's say, Black Lives Matter trying to like eliminate racist policing, or this idea of like having a racial symmetry, let's say, between racial composition of the environment, the community that's being served, and the police officers. I did see that come up, like this idea, like for example, if in like inner city streets of Chicago you would have all white police officers in an all black neighborhood, that could create like problems precisely because of fantasy structures in some sense, because in some sense, like for example, what was the thesis, the thesis, and this will tie into the racist fantasy book, that your thesis in the racist fantasy is that we cannot just eliminate racism through like social policies or through like education, that there's something in the structure of fantasy that we have to talk about. So maybe let's use that as a way in.
Yeah, absolutely true, right? My point is that so obviously racism is often structural, it's ideological, it's formed within the basis of the social structure. But I think it also, just as you were saying, has this psychic dimension, which I think I would say accounts for its recalcitrance, like why it's so difficult to eradicate. And it's because of the enjoyment that it brings the people who are caught up in it, right? And so the idea in the book is that, so just a little bit about fantasy. So fantasy is structured by, you have a fantasizing subject, right? And you have then an object that is desired, object of desire. And then you have some kind of barrier to that object. And anyone who's fantasized knows that the lion's share of the fantasizing has to do with the barrier, not the getting the object. Like if it's just the point of getting the object, it's such a small part of the fantasy. And my proof for this is if you watch any Hollywood film, the point where, if it's a romance, the point where they're together happy, it's always very little short. And sometimes it never even happens. So like it happens and then there's some disruption to it. So the point is that the obstacle is really what fuels the enjoyment in the fantasy. But yet the person doesn't, no one perceives the obstacle as that in that way, right? Like no one thinks like, oh, I really get off on these obstacles, unless you're perverse, and then that's a whole other question. But I think that, in what I call the racist fantasy, the racial other gets put in the position of the obstacle. So at once, the racist is getting off on that racial other, but perceiving it as the barrier to their ultimate enjoyment that they would get if they got the object. I cite this little passage from Mein Kampf and Hitler. And Hitler has a great, I shouldn't say great and Hitler probably in the same sentence, but he has a great example because he says the lascivious Jew, he's talking about a guy with his satanic grin, seduces this pure German woman, right? Like, so that the satanic joy, he says. So that, and the ideas that I try to lay out is that the Aryan German woman would not be so desirable if not for this barrier that the satanic joy of the Jewish guy puts up against her. And so in a way, what Hitler's really getting off on when he has that fantasy is not the German woman that he imagines having sex with. It's actually the barrier, the obstacle of the Jewish guy with the satanic joy. So that to me, that's like the paradigmatic example, but there's just tons of them. I go through quite a few, maybe ad nauseum in the book.
Right. So maybe let's start slow and go step by step. So like you started to introduce the structure of fantasy there, and maybe that might be it might be new to some people, it might be confusing to some people. I mean, with a Lacanian perspective and a background, like the fundamental fantasy is something which structures subjective enjoyment and things like that. And you're making this distinction between certain psychological types, like unless you're perverse, so like perverse subjects has a different relationship to the fundamental fantasy. So how is it that fantasy, let's say, and impossibility and obstacle and enjoyment, how are these all linked in Lacan's view? And do you basically have a similar view, or are you just taking this and updating or applying it, or is there a renovation?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like, certainly Lacan influenced how I think about this. I was not consciously trying to lay out a Lacanian idea or consciously trying to depart from him. I was just saying, like, looking at what the structure is. So yeah, you're right. I mean, he doesn't talk that much about fantasy. So it's a really, he does make this distinction between what he calls the objet and the object of desire, but he doesn't fully go into it, and he doesn't talk about the obstacle. He doesn't talk about it so much as an obstacle, although that's kind of that's the implication of what he says. So in certain ways, I'm building on it and kind of following through certain implications that he lays out. In other ways, maybe saying exactly what he would say, but there's not a point where he says, "Oh, fantasy is this," blah, blah, blah. And so I'm just taking that directly. So even though he has a whole seminar called The Logic of Fantasy, it's a fascinating seminar because it's seminar 14. He basically never lays out what the logic of fantasy is. It's a lot of mathematics and logic. So I don't know about the answer to that question. I think that's a hard question for me.
Okay, maybe.
But no, okay, I'll go on. Sorry, I'll answer the other part. So I think that but Lacan's idea is that fantasy provides the subject access to a way of structuring its enjoyment. So that is an idea that I completely am taking from Lacan, and I think that that's what I see. The racist fantasy gives the racist that's a form to their enjoyment, like a pathway to structure their enjoyment. And I think that, to me, is maybe Lacan's most important insight about fantasy.
Okay. That's helpful. And I was gonna say, just quickly, I remember reading a quote from Lacan where he says that his work and psychoanalysis in his tradition is mostly focused on the clinic, but that through these clinical observations of psychological structures, that it might have relevance universally for social life. And so, like, it, do you, like, I guess, like, what I see in your work, perhaps, or what I would ask, I suppose, is taking discoveries or taking concepts which were derived in the clinic and seeing insofar as they have social, historical, political application. What do you think about this relationship?
Is that the way it goes? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. I guess I think of Lacan as a philosopher, not as a clinician. I mean, I know he thought he was a clinician.
Well, he said he was an anti-philosopher.
I know. I just, here's the problem with what you said, and that, you're right. He did say that, but I feel like I don't give this magical structure to the clinic, right? Like, I don't think like, oh, there are these incredible insights gained. Like, for instance, like his conception of the structure of signification. Well, he owes that mostly to Claude Lévi-Strauss, right? He doesn't owe it to like clinical practice at all. So I just think a lot of times when he says, and like his idea, his conception of desire, I think comes mostly from the Hegel scholar Alexander Kojève, who in the late 1930s taught Hegel to Lacan. Not correctly, but he did teach him to Lacan. So that I think that he got more from desire from Kojève than he ever got from the clinic. So I know he doesn't think of himself as a philosopher, and he hates that idea, and he thinks of himself as a psychoanalyst and who's deriving ideas from the clinic. I don't believe that. So I don't like this image of these ideas were derived from the clinic and now we're translating them to culture. No, because I think that's not how ideas form. I don't think they form in like, they're like, that seems like such a liberal way to think. And like, it's like first you derive these ideas. It comes back to this whole particular universal thing we were talking about, right? Like, first you derive them in this little particular way, and then you can apply them universally. I think it's the opposite. I think first the ideas come universally, and then you can find ways to particularly work them out. So I guess that whole map of how, I know that there are a lot of people that work on Lacan, like Jacques-Alain Miller, for instance, who would say exactly what the way you just put it. Like, that's how he would think of it.
I'm thinking about the line Lacan had of where he's like, something along the lines of, I only ever learned from my patients, or I only ever learned, like he's studying the speech of the annals. And like, do you think this is a little misleading?
I think it's a lie. I think it's a lie. Like, I think people say that, like, look, sorry, he was an incredibly learned guy. Like, he was an incredibly well-read thinker, incredibly. And I say this all the time as a teacher, like, oh, I've actually got all my ideas from students, and it's just not true. It's not true, right? Like, I know that's a lie because I've said it as a lie before.
Shots fired.
So that's how I know it's a lie. It's just not true. I just think people say that because it seems democratic or whatever, right? Like, it seems democratic. Like, oh, I've got the proletariat have told me, and that's how it's not true. That's not how ideas work. Like, they're like out in the world, and you pick them up. You don't get them from, I don't know.
A little bit romanticization of the rabble, a little bit.
There you go. That's what I would
go
say.
To the rabble. Yeah. Let's focus back on the rabble and the rabbling around there. So
good.
So one of the interesting things that stuck out to me in sort of one of your reflections on racism and the social structure and this, I like the way you, like, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation was because I really like the way you articulate the the paradoxical ineradicability of racism from just an educational point of view, or from just a, like we all want, let's say, like, even if we all societally, we don't want to be racist, but racism has this intractable dimension to it. And I think that one of the interesting things you're bringing up in this book, and this an opening potentially in these conversations about the book, is the enjoyment dimension of racism. I don't think many people think about, like, even if like they're like, even if they like, have racist views, and they even accept that they have racist views, or maybe they disavow that they have racist views, whatever. I don't think many people think about enjoyment that can be derived from whatever form of racism it might be. So, what's the point you're trying to get here, and how do you think it's operating?
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? Like, I think that, so both the people that are racist think it's just, I think this is the consensus, that racism is a question of knowledge, right? Like, if you're racist, you don't know enough and you need to learn more. And I think there's a failure I think that identification of racism with enjoyment is it goes so much against, because we think of it as even the people who are, I guess there are, what's percent of the population, like 5% that's avowedly racist. Okay. Even they come the closest probably, right? Like, they come the closest to saying, like, racism is my form of enjoyment and I'm sticking to it, right? Like, the Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, right? Like, they're marching, they're kind of, but the other 95%, I think it's for them, those who say, oh, there is no racism, to hide their own racism, or the people that are trying to eradicate it. I think that there's no sense that it provides that one of the things that makes it appealing is it's the enjoyment that it provides. And I think the reason is because no one wants to think that it's appealing. Everyone thinks it's terrible. No one, which I of course agree, but no one wants to say, well, okay, we all intellectually think it's terrible, and yet there are so many people, even the people that intellectually think it's terrible, are invested in it. There must be something appealing about it. So I think that's a really key thing. I almost called the book something like The Appeal of Racism, and then that title got nixed. Absolutely, right?
Yeah, but that's a powerful title.
Yeah.
It's a pretty provocative title.
Yeah, I know. But that was not. Even as the racist.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
No, and just to bring up this point, which I think speaks to what you're talking about. Even titled The Racist, I just wanted to be the racist fantasy. And so the first press rejected it because they said racism doesn't need to be theorized. We already know it's bad. I'm like, okay, so that seems wrong. And then the next press said, okay, it's fine, but you have to have a subtitle to make it clear you're against racism. Because they thought racist fantasy makes it seem like I'm saying racism is only a fantasy and not real. Of course, not the point, but so I didn't like that. I didn't want this subtitle, but whatever, I agreed. So I think it really, like, this identification of enjoyment with racism, it really cuts, like, there's something about it that is troubling to people, as evidenced by just the history of this book before it came out, I think.
You're alienated from your product. You're alienated.
I am. That is true. That is true.
That's funny. Okay, so I want to focus on this point a little bit more, like, because I think it's crucial for what you're trying to communicate. Like, for example, you gave the example of, like, say, like, the Charlottesville people, and like the 5% of, let's say, people in the United States who would, like, identify to some degree of being racist. Like, would you even say, like, they would think of it as they enjoying it? Like, because I think they would think about it as, like, it's an obstacle in the way, but, like, they're not thinking about it like you're thinking about it, where the obstacle is the enjoyment. Like, they're probably right. Like, they're probably thinking about it like, let's get rid of the obstacle. Yeah, like, but they don't realize they enjoy that.
Yeah. Of course, they don't realize that they enjoy the obstacle, right? I mean, that's what it means. That's why they're racist, right? Like, if you realize you enjoy the obstacle, you cease to be racist, right? Like, that's the whole point, because then I think I say this somewhere, like, you take responsibility for your enjoyment. When you see that, like, I really am getting off on the obstacle, then your whole structure of your enjoyment changes. Yeah, of course they don't realize that. I just was why I said that was they're a little closer to, like, they have rituals attached to their racism. There is a little bit, and they're not trying to get rid of it. Like, they don't think that racism is a negative thing. They think it's good. They think it's a correct apprehension of the world. So, yeah, but I see your point. Like, they're not really theorizing it as enjoying it. No.
Well, they're not thinking about it the way you're thinking about it.
Right.
Like,
clearly not. Clearly.
Yeah. Like, I mean,
right.
And like what I say, or what I would ask you here is, when you get this perspectival shift on the obstacle, like, say, for example, the perspectival shift on the obstacle that you're enjoying the racist fantasy or something like that, and then it falls away. Is that true in all situations? Does it deviate, for example, like with a pervert? Like, because with the pervert, like, they know the obstacle, but they enjoy the obstacle. Like, yeah. So what are the conditions upon which it falls away potentially? Or what are the conditions upon which it gets even maybe played with or like turned into some sort of kink?
Yeah. So your examples are good. So, right. So definitely perversion. The whole point of perversion is it gets off on obstacles, right? So in a sense we all do, but it turns the obstacle into the end point. So it doesn't, like, having the revelation that it gets off on the obstacle, it does nothing for the person who's perverse, because that's evident for them. And then, so I think you have to be some kind of normal neurotic for that process to work, for the process of, you confront the encounter with, I'm getting off on the obstacle, not on the object behind it, then that has a transformative effect. I think you have to be in a normal neurotic position for that to work.
And is this one of the reasons why it's often said in analysis that the pervert's not analyzable?
Yeah, exactly. Right. That the pervert and the psychotic are not analyzable because they can't. I mean, the idea is that they're less susceptible to transference, but it's also, I think this is also a part of it, that they can't, that the very point you want to get them to, in a certain way, they're already there, but they're there in a way that they've missed they've short-circuited the very thing that you have to go through in analysis. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure I'm a normie neurotic. Yeah. Yeah. So in regards to, so we got this structure of fantasy, the obstacle, and then what makes the fantasy a racist fantasy is that the obstacle is the racist other. And you sort of suggest that this has a universal structure to it. I guess that can be situated in line with the intro where we were talking about your books, Universality and Politics. Can you go into a little bit more detail about how the universal and the particular are functioning in regards to the racist fantasy?
Sure, but what I meant was that that is the universal structure of fantasy, right? That they're the obstacle, the object of desire, and the racist fantasy just puts a racial other in that position of the obstacle. That's what makes it a racist fantasy,
right?
But yeah, I think that the racist has to believe in their own particularity, right? Like, they have to, and I think that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. It's a really good question. I hadn't thought of it, but I think it is true that the racist fantasy is there to shore up the particular identity of the subject who's ensconced in it. So I think it's a way, I think the racist fantasy is a way of avoiding universality. And then if you confront that, in a way, it's also avoiding your own singularity, because you're clinging to a certain particular identity, racial identity, and then you use the racist fantasy to do that. But then I think you're right. If you have this moment where the fantasy collapses because you realize you're getting off on the barrier, the obstacle, then I think that does put you into the position of singularity. So I think it does distance you from your own particular identity. You're like, wait a minute, my whiteness that ceases to be anything to me. Like, I no longer get anything from that psychically, right? And then that I think pushes you into this much more singular position.
Yeah, it's a super nice thing. It's a super interesting thing to think. As it regards, so like what's coming to my mind, just because I'm in the middle of the science of logic, is how the negation of the negation features so strongly, and like I was saying, this movement to singularity features quite strongly. And Hegel has a nice line he repeats a couple times where he says the vanishing of the vanishing. So it's like there's this lack, like which maybe the racist fantasy is operating in, perhaps. But then, like what came to my mind when you were describing how it functions, putting you in a position of singularity, perhaps, is the vanishing of the vanishing. It's almost like the lack itself vanishes. And what do you make of that?
No, I think it's a great parallel that you just made. Like I think that's exactly right. Like you lose precisely that thing that, well, and then I think it like you lose the thing that seemed to be responsible for your lack, and then but I think then you confront yourself as a lacking subject and realize that that is what you are as a subject, right? Like I think that even the term lack suggests that there's something you're lacking, but I think that the point is, of course, that you're lacking nothing, right? And that is if the lack is filled in, then you cease to exist. So I think that's I think the parallel to Hegel is pretty nice there. Yeah.
And just what you said there sort of reminded me. So I did and there's probably interesting parallels here with your work, because I know you organize or co-organize the LAC conference. And I did a YouTube series during the Corona times called The Philosophy of Lack with a couple of guys. We're discussing basically the idea of the philosophy of lack was to take ancient world concepts like atomism or Platonic forms, and to think about those things through the lens of lack. And it was a really fun, it was a really fun series there, and it got some interesting responses. But one of the things that's coming to my mind is one of the guys who was on that series with me, Alex Ebert, who's actually was, I don't know if you know Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros, but he's the lead singer of that band. And he was saying, he made an interesting point in the first LAC series where he said, I need nothing. Like instead of like negativizing nothing, like he positivized nothing. Like, so when you're saying like, the whole point is that you're lacking, but you are lacking nothing.
Yeah.
Like it's like this positivization of the lack. And I don't think this is really like, is there a way to teach this, so to speak? Not like it's not a traditional education. It's something you have to like experience and move through, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's why Lacan says you have to go through analysis, right? Like he's trying to get at this idea, or Freud says it too, but that it can't really be taught. I do think that I really like that idea, the lack as a positive. I mean, I think that's what Lacan is getting at with this notion of the objet, right? Like it's a nothing that has a positive form. So I think that's a great formulation.
Yeah, and that's where it really clicked for me when I was from my personal educational history, or like my personal sort of learning history or whatever, was sort of in reading Less Than Nothing, sort of focusing on the objet as this object of lack itself, like it's the positivization of nothing. I think that was really interesting. So let's get into what I was trying to get at. I don't know if I'm correct either, but what I was trying to get at with your thesis is like, well, here, let me just frame it as a question. Is there like, so there's the racist fantasy is when the racial other is the obstacle. Now, to what extent does this have a universe? Like, does it appear in China? Does it appear in Korea? Does it appear in all historical time periods? Does it appear in, you gave the examples of Jews and Germans in the 20th century, and you also gave examples of the Southern white woman and Black masculinity. And so like these are, how extensive is this structure? How universal is this structure?
I think it's universal in modernity. So I think that, I give other examples too. Like I talk about the way in which there was after the Kanto earthquake in Japan, there was a massive slaughter of Koreans who were thought not to be responsible for the earthquake, but there were these fires that broke out and the Koreans were blamed for them. And then, thousands were killed. And then I talk about the Rwandan genocide, which also has the same structure, right? So it's very interesting. Then I talk about Bollywood and the use of brownface in Bollywood. So I think that it is universal in. I don't think that racism. This is not an uncontroversial point, but I don't think it's that controversial. I don't think racism exists before modernity. I don't think that there is. So there was clearly religious hatred, like for people on college, and there was also hatred for people outside of one's own community. Like the Greeks invented the term barbarian for people who didn't speak Greek and they were outsiders, but it wasn't racialized. So I think that that racism and the creation of race, those two things are basically the same for me. That exists only in modernity, and I think it's because this is one of the theses of the book, that it depends upon that I don't think capitalism can function without racism. And I think that the racist fantasy supplements. So we talked about capitalist fantasy, right? That I'm going to overcome my alienation at some point by getting the perfect commodity or getting enough commodity. Well, that never is going to happen.
The car there.
That's never going to happen, right? Like I'm never going to get there. So I need something to explain to myself why I'm not getting there. And that's where I think racism comes to the rescue, right? Like, and this is why I think racism is even more virulent among people that are have less, right? Because although maybe that's not true, because oftentimes the more you have, the more you feel like you're not at you're the further you have to go. So maybe that's not true. But the idea is that racism, you can take solace in racism to explain why you're not getting this perfect enjoyment from the commodity, right? Or why you're not getting enough commodities because, the racial other is in the way of that. So that's what I would say. I think it's absolutely within, I can't imagine capitalist modernity without racism. I don't think it's possible.
Okay, so it's not universal in the
Hegelian sense.
A historical, like
right.
It's just a feature of modernity. Do you think that's because of the level of diversity that the modern subject has to? I don't know.
No. Do you think that? I don't know.
I'm just asking.
No, I don't think that, because I think it's always a mistake to think that racism is a response to some actual condition, of difference. Like, to me, it's that causality is wrong. This is not my idea. This idea I got from this book, Racecraft, by Barbara and Karen Field. So I think it was the best book on racism. Their idea is that it's racism that creates the diversity. So if you don't, so you can't say that the diversity is to, like they say, their favorite example is Black people. There's a lot of racism, or no, I can't get the example, but their point is that even the way that we talk about racism, and we say those people, like, say there's large numbers of Black people in Atlanta are encounter prejudice because they're Black, right? Like, so that way of formulating it for them, it's putting the cart before the horse. Like, it's seeing the way it's like blaming the people who are the only reason that we see people as white, as Black, as whatever, is because of the racist act in the first place, right? Like, why do we know? That's their point. Like, why do we notice it? And that requires. So I don't think it's the diversity of the modern world. I don't think so, and that's why I also don't think. I think this is totally wrong. That if there's just a total intermixing, then we're getting rid of racism. I don't think that. I think we'll find. I mean, look at the way. It's a fascinating thing in the United States right now, right? The way in which Latino population is more and more becoming white in the minds of people that are Latino. Yes. so this is, I think, interesting, right? Like there's a sense in which it's not the demographic itself. That's not what's determinative, right? What's determinative is the way in which we view things.
Right. So like, it's like putting it under the psychological side as opposed to like the biological fact of diversity.
Absolutely.
It's more the psychological side of the categories. The categories create racism. There's an interesting thing I want to run by because this is something I've been trying to think. So my background's anthropological. I was first trained as an anthropologist. I was specifically in evolutionary anthropology, and I was interested in the relationship between great apes and humans evolutionarily. So one of the cool things that's been discovered, and one of the points I'm trying to make in teaching Hegel is like that there's a lot of work, and I actually brought this up to you in our first conversation. I think there's a lot of work to be done at the intersection between Hegel and Darwin, because Darwin comes after Hegel, and oftentimes there's this schism between the life sciences or the natural sciences and the humanities, the philosophy, where I think there's a big conversation to be had there. But in any case, so like, I mean, Hegel says things about, different populations outside of Europe, but he didn't have like a Darwinian evolutionary understanding or anything like that. Now, so in like a Darwinian evolutionary understanding, humans all derive from Africa, and actually like from like the genetic population sort of, they don't in contemporary population genetics, especially in anthropology, and this comes from anthropology, not biology, is that in the population geneticists, they don't study races. They study populations of genetic distributions, basically, to try to like de-racialize the field and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And one of the important things there is like, actually like the category of Black or the category of African is just obscenely simplistic, because like actually, like if you just look at the genetic diversity, it's like 90% of the genetic diversity is in Africa. And like, if you have like, for example, a European, an East Asian, or a Native American, they're all genetically more similar than anyone, like say a Kenyan and an Ethiopian and a Nigerian, because the populations have such a like deep history that goes back a long time in evolutionary time speaking. Right. And then so the point is that there's a diversity here which is being poorly categorized because of very simplistic categories like Black and white, which actually the actual genetic data doesn't like obliterates these categories. Like where we in some.
Can I just say I just
go ahead.
Such an important point. I think like that's absolutely crucial, right? Because I think that I was thinking of this. I think of this often. These like ancestry.com or whatever these things are, right? Like, look, to me, it's always, and I think it's racist the way in which the ancestry stops at a certain point, right? Like, I could save everyone the money, and I could say, look, you want to know where your ultimate ancestry is?
Africa.
You're African.
Yeah, like, we're the white Africans and so forth.
Yeah, whatever, right? But yeah, you're African. So it's interesting. Like, that's the gesture of racism. It's like, where do you stop the path back? Because if you go far enough, then. But I think that's an incredible.
If you go far enough back, we're all derived from quarks and gluons in the Big Bang.
Right. Exactly. But the point is, I think your point is really great. That to see the diversity in Africa rather than in what's subsequent is really, really crucial. Yeah.
It's
sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry. No, but I think I'd like to get your point of view on this and to go to like what ideas are coming to your mind here, because I've just been trying to think about it, because like I get a perspectival shift on it, because when I was in studying anthropology, I was thinking about it in like an evolutionary historicist way. And now, like after sort of, becoming more familiar with continental philosophy and sort of having basically a worldview that can't be reduced to evolutionary historicism, I'm trying to think about how this might help us think race in social ways, like that our very frame of reference, like coming from, let's say, European philosophy and colonial history, is itself got this hidden blind spot with like the normative standard for the way you view a human is actually European. And like for example, like, and that messes up the categories of way we see diversity, because like, for example, like maybe this is I think this is an interesting example, is like, you know how Carl Sagan, they sent this golden disc into space through a satellite. Have you ever seen that? And the golden disc, it's like an interesting like human reflection gesture, like that we sent this disc with like our coordinates in space and like all this information about the species, and like we just send it into the abyss, and like maybe someone will stumble upon it or something like that. But like the human, they have two human forms on the disc, is a man and a woman. So interesting, they recognize sexual difference in the disc, man and woman, but the forms are so European form looking.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm just saying, like, this is how deep it goes into our unconscious, like that we, whereas actually we should be seeing it the other way around, where actually Africans is the default genetic diversity.
Paradigmatic, right.
Yeah, that's more paradigmatic actually. And I think this is messing everyone up ideologically speaking, this because it's creating all these weird I don't know, social tensions.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have anything?
No,
else?
no.
I can go on to another question if you want to.
Yeah. Just go on, because I just want to underline what you said. I totally agree with that. I think it's a crucial point. But your point about Hegel is interesting, because that hasn't. The only person that's kind of close to that is Catherine Malibu, who wrote a book on Hegel and plasticity, and then she talks about neuroscience a little bit. So there's a little bit of but interestingly, most of the connection of Hegel with science, I'm sure you know this, is with physics, right? Like, because so much, like even what we just said, the line you brought up, the identity of identity and difference, like in a way that's modern physics, right? So it's really clear to see the connection there. But Hegel is his philosophy of nature is weighed down by the fact that he's pre-Darwin. I think that he didn't believe in evolution. So I think that's why no one reads the philosophy of nature anymore, except a few people.
Yeah. No, I mean, it would be interesting. I think, like, it's, to me, an open project, because, like, for example, like one thing I like doing is studying like the last paragraph of great books. So like one of the things I did in the Science of Logic course was compare and contrast the last paragraph of Science of Logic with the last paragraph of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And it's like the last paragraph of Science of Logic, we end up in the absolute idea, comprehending itself, and so forth. And in some sense, that's like where the logic is leading. And then in Darwin's On the Origin of Species, you end up with this endless multiplicity of life forms. So in some sense, like the question for me is, like, on the one hand,
from so simple a beginning, right?
Yeah, from so simple a beginning. Yeah, from one or a few forms, you have this endless multiplicity of forms. So in the Darwinian picture, we have this multiplicity of life forms. And in Hegel, we have this absolute idea comprehending itself. And it's like, what's the relationship between life and the idea? Yeah. It's like, I think that's an open question, but, like, of course you're saying, okay, philosophy of nature is flawed and stuff like this.
Yeah. I mean, just because he didn't, like, the leap in biological sciences happened after Hegel died. So that's the problem.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the crucial things is, and what I would try to emphasize is to try to read Hegel, not to like sort of identify with what Hegel said necessarily, but to read Hegel so that we could think post-Hegelian content. You know, like things that happen after Hegel. Okay, but absolutely. So back to your topic. You bring up Fichte a lot with the obstacle and the fantasy. Do you think that Fichte? So could you maybe go into a little bit about how Fichte is useful for you, and potentially based on what you've said about Lacan, is Fichte lacking in Lacan?
Yeah, I think he is. It's interesting. So Lacan says in his Seminar 21, the non-duped heir, he says, object A is perhaps what I have invented. And Yeah, that's probably true, but he did. You could say he stole this idea from Fichte. Although, so Fichte he's a direct follower and disciple in a certain sense of Immanuel Kant. But here's what he's trying to do. So Kant has this whole structure of what is the basis for what can be represented in the world. What are the possible objects of experience? What's the conditions of possibility of experience? And Fichte says, okay, and Kant has a table of 12 categories, and which he basically just comes up with. He takes them from traditional logic, it comes up with them. Fichte says, well, you can't do that. He's like, you have to derive them. And so what's the source of them? And he says, well, let's say that what's most fundamental, what's our absolute starting point? And he says it's the self-positing of the I. So I am the starting point for everything. And then what matters is what I say. He doesn't think the I creates the world, but he thinks the I makes things significant in the world, right? So, and then he says, so this I expanding itself outward. But then he comes up with this idea. The German word is the Anstos, or it's translated weird in the Fichte translations as like the check or something. But it's basically, it's a nice German word which has two opposite meanings. German is great for this. It means the obstacle and the impetus. So Fichte thinks we have to also posit, in order to have a coherent or even a meaningful world at all, we have to posit this Anstos, this obstacle that's also an impetus for us, or else nothing is meaningful. And so Fichte is basically talking about the necessity of some barrier, some obstacle that we encounter that then drives us to be concerned or care about the world, or to desire anything in the world, or to put it in my language, to enjoy anything in the world. So I think that for that, I just found other people have made this connection to Lacan briefly, but I think it's really crucial. And I think that I think Fichte is really the one who theorizes the importance of the obstacle more than any other thinker does.
I just think it's really interesting here because, perhaps in Fichte's philosophy with this Anstos as sort of representing this concept with two opposite meanings, it's sort of similar in Hegel's philosophy with sublation, because sublation also has two opposite meanings. And so German language really offers this interesting dimension, which may be to some degree lacking in English or
it's funny because English is the richest language. We have the most words by far, but I think we don't have so many words that have this double meaning, right? Like, Heimlich is another one. Like, does canny simultaneously mean uncanny? Not really, right? So I think it's like Heimlich is the word for homely or something, or canny in German. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's interesting. These opposites.
The question I would have based on Fichte with the Anstos is, so again with, of course, with Hegel and the science of logic in particular, like he's really going after some others in the German idealist tradition. It's clear he's got like the laser eyes for Kant, right? Like it's just like constantly, right? But like, so with the obstacles, so like my question would be, do you think there's a way in which the obstacle needs to be in some sense eternalized in a positivist way, so we see like, instead of thinking about it as an obstacle, we see it as an impetus? You go from, let's say, desire to drive, or is it that the obstacle itself falls away? Like, how do you think, like what's like?
No, I don't think it's
for like. Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You want to finish your question?
Well, just my final thought would be, how are you like what's like sort of the personal reflective thing that we could take away, or the listeners could take away, of like thinking about their own obstacles? And like I think it's like really helpful, like if I could positivize the obstacle, like I could get a new perspectival shift on it, but then it might fall away, or like how like we were giving the example
I think you use the word internalize. I think that's a very Hegelian way to think about it.
Yeah,
right? Like I think he would say, see the obstacle as yours. Right? Like that's the thing, right? Like, so it's not getting rid of the obstacle. It's not. And I think when he says, about Kant, and you're right to say Kant's his usual whipping boy. I think what he would say is, famously says that Kant famously says, I want to set up the limits of thought. And then Hegel says, this is in the Encyclopedic Logic, once we've seen a limit, we're already beyond the limit, right? And I think that in a way, that's exactly what you just said, that you find the obstacle and then you've internalized it and it's part of your psychic structure, but it's not gone as an obstacle. Instead, you realize it's my obstacle, right? Like it doesn't have anything to do with the other that I've put this onto, right?
But then does there necessarily lead to so earlier in the conversation you were saying how once you realize, like in the context of the racist fantasy, in the context of the racist fantasy is once I see that the obstacle is not an external obstacle limiting sort of like my total enjoyment or something like that, but actually it's mine, then could there be a change of the content? Like the content could vanish.
Well, I think it would.
But the obstacle maybe won't vanish.
No, isn't that the crucial point? That it wouldn't make any sense for the racist content to remain once you realized it was you couldn't even do it. So I think you're right. Like, and isn't this true all the time in Hegel, that you realize that the form is what is decisive, and the content you can be you can be indifferent to, right? And because you realize what's crucial here is the form of the obstacle. And so I can put whatever I want in that content, right? And because it's my obstacle. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and so that's actually like, it's an opportunity to say, like, that's how I'm teaching the science of logic, is like, I'm trying to teach the form of the logic, but I'm trying to say, but we can approach content that Hegel didn't know about. Because
absolutely right.
Because absolutely right. The doors are open here. So like in terms of, but we have to think content, but we just have to be like, it's almost like he's calling for like a courage to think content, like to think the obstacles of our day. And I think that's also, and that's originally what called me to have this conversation about your book, is because I think what you're doing is you're having I think it's the courage to confront the contents of the day.
Well, thanks. I hope that's true. Yeah. That's what I was aiming to do. Yeah.
Right. So, okay. So a few more, I think, major points that I think would be interesting to bring up. So you also participated in a book called Lacon and Race. Is that correct?
Yeah, but that's just a part of this book.
It's just a part of the book.
Yeah, it's not, that essay is just became part of this book. It's nothing separate.
Okay, so in the context of the relationship between these books, is there anything there that you think's worth identifying, or just maybe a subset?
Yeah, I would just say that I think Sheldon George, who was one of the co-editors of that book, I mean, he also wrote a book called Trauma and Race, which is, to my mind, the definitive Lacan and race book. So he was very important for my thinking on all these questions. So Sheldon's a great fan of Star Trek, so I wanted to write a book with him on Star Trek, but he turned me down. But yeah, I think that would be the only thing I would say. And then a lot of other people in that book I think are really good, and it's interesting because I think there has been. I started the conversation by saying psychoanalysis kind of hasn't really talked about racism so much, but I think that started to change, and that book came out of that change. So you mentioned the LAC conference. We have one coming up in a month or a couple months, and there's quite a bit of, when we first started it, maybe, I don't know, 6 years ago, there was one panel on race, maybe. This year there's probably 6 out of 25 panels. So it's kind of and that's 3 papers per panel. So it's changed quite a bit.
Well, I know, I don't know, this is super relevant, but I remember Frantz Fanon bringing up, like, one of his criticisms of Freud was that Freud never theorized race. And so, like, at the grounds of psychoanalysis, you have kind of this, is there a resistance internal to psychoanalysis? Like, I also watched this documentary, I forget the university that put it out, but it was it was a documentary about Black psychoanalysts, and like they were talking about like, you know, the differences between white clinic and the Black clinic and stuff like. I don't know if you how much you think this is important, but what do you see happening here? What do you, I mean, with this, like the example you just gave of the LAT conference and this race becoming more of an issue or
yeah, I just think
conversation.
I think it's look, part of it is that the thinkers that are at the forefront of thinking psychoanalytically today are also very politically committed. And so I think it sort of follows that they would be concerned with questions of racism because they're concerned with egalitarian politics. So that I would just say that, like, I do know this. I mean, clearly that's true about Freud, that he didn't concern himself with that question. Lacan too, but I mean, there's a aside in the television interview where he says that racism is going to get worse and worse, but he doesn't really offer a theory of racism. It's really, I mean, I think Fanon is a big figure. I think Slavoj Žižek was a pretty important figure in this movement. So there are other people, but I think I don't necessarily have a theory about it. Like, why now? Like, I just think that I think part of it is the way that, and this, I would credit Slavoj with this, that he made it clear that there was a political project, universalist project inherent in psychoanalysis, specifically Lacan's psychoanalysis. So I think that's probably the origin of it.
Right. Okay. Okay, so there's a paper by Alenka Zupancic called "Libidinal is Political." Have you read that or come across that? No.
That sounds good.
I just wanted to throw out her thesis in that paper and sort of see how it relates to your thesis in the racist fantasy, or if it does, and like what maybe relationships there are. She says that the libidinal is political means that the libidinal in politics reflect negativities and impasses of the social essence, that there is a conceptual negativity at work at their core and deploys something that's not of the order of being, the real, an inherent impasse of being. So with that idea, I get this idea that sort of like, you know, that libidinal is political insofar as that there are just the impasses of the social order on a sexual level get inscribed into the political order, and potentially vice versa, that impasses of the political order get inscribed in libidinal fantasy. But it's thinking about like this as like an impasse of being, probably something related to like impossibility or something related to maybe enjoyment.
Right. I think for Alenka, libidinal means impasse, right? Like that's what it means for her. I think that's the definition for her. So I think, like in her book, What is Sex? She gives sex an ontological status as the impasse of being. So I think that's right. And I think that I mean, one of the things she's really concerned about is the way in which we don't theorize the impasse when the constitutive nature of the impasse when we think about politics. And I think that's a really important thing. And what she's really fighting against is this technocratic impulse of political, like thinking that there's some kind of solution that we can find to our political problems. And her point is that the impasse is not transcendable, right? That the impasse is constitutive of the political field. So I think that's I think that's completely right. And I think that the racist fantasy is a way to try to escape the impasse, right? Like you're fantasizing a way around the impasse.
That's fantastic. And it leads really nicely into my next question. So there's this article that Žižek wrote, which is kind of going viral. It just it published last night. It's called
it goes viral that fast?
Well, it's just getting a lot of attention because it's about the woke. It's called "The Woke is Here to Stay."
Okay.
And so he ends the article on a point which I think is really interesting, and I think it'd be interesting to talk to you about. This is the final sentence of the article.
Okay.
He says, "The woke awakens us to racism and sexism, precisely to enable us to go on sleeping. They show us certain realities so that we can go on ignoring the true roots and depth of our racial and sexual traumas. End quote. So what do you make of that? Because I think it's related potentially to the pseudo left versus potentially thinking a new left.
Yeah. I think that's what he's getting. I haven't read the article, but I assume that's what he's onto. That like to cleanse, like the idea of like we want to cleanse or push each individual to cleanse themselves of their biases, their particular prejudices, like that. It seems to me like that's misses where the real racist, misogynist structures exist, right? Which exist in they exist structurally, and they exist in relation to capital. And so if you don't think that, then all this like individual purging or whatever is happening, right? Like that's never going to be efficacious. For one thing, no matter how much I once had a student who said, every day I wake up in the morning and I try to purge one racist idea out of my head. She was white. I try to purge one racist idea out of my head each day. I'm like, wow, you have a lot of racist ideas in there if you still are going, but I didn't say that. But I thought, well, is that really doing any, like, shouldn't you have spent that time, which you wasted on this purge, actually like going out and like trying to fight against some form of structural racism, if it's an issue that you're concerned about, rather than doing this individualistic thing that doesn't really affect anyone, right? So yeah, I feel like that's what he's on about here. I mean, I haven't read the article, so I don't want to totally, I mean, maybe he says something that I totally hate somewhere else in it. So
sure,
probably not, but I usually agree with him. But I think that's what it seems to me that's what he's on about.
Right. I think it's, yeah. I mean, I think like the basic thing is just like the theme in Jesus' work, like that people are enjoying their ideology and that not really wanting to confront the true impasse in a Zupančič idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think the way in which this would be something he would really be on about, is this diversity industry and the way that it's like become a whole cottage industry around this thing that's become a source of what should be a thing that is an obstacle to profit, becomes just yet another way of like turning something profitable. So I think, to me, that's the worst part of it. I in my mind.
I mean, I was blown away by your example there of the student saying, every morning I try to purge a racist idea out of my head, and immediately brought to mind like this idea that what's going on in certain woke leftist circles is similar to like very fundamentalist religious communities with because like they'll do purges and some, like they'll do
right,
like big fasts and like a purging of sin, right? Like like our lust and our sexuality is sinful, and like we have to purge ourselves of sexuality.
It's a great analogy, because I remember I grew up fundamentalist, and one of the ideas was, so you go up at a revival, you go up to be saved, right? But you never stopped going. Like, even though you've gone up once, you were saved, it's supposedly done, over and done. You had to go. You felt this urge, like even if you've come before, you're not sure, come again. Like you never were sure. Like when they never said to you, all right, you're cool, you're done, you don't even have to come to church anymore, you're saved. No, it's a super egoic pressure. And I think that's what that student was responding to, a kind of, or evincing this absolute super egoic pressure. You've never done enough. And she was a good anti-racist, right? Like she didn't need to do this purging. She was doing her part. She was teaching in an anti-racist, so it's fine. But there was this incredible super egoic pressure that she was putting on herself.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, and it's interesting also that you grew up fundamentalist. I'm sure it gives you an interesting lens with which to view these things. I mean, how homologous is it? How analogous?
It's absolutely. Yeah, I think it's absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
I don't think there's almost. Look, the only difference is the content. right? Like, to come back to the thing we were talking about before, like, the only difference is there's a different content, but there's the same kind of religious zealotry involved, I think. And there's also the same kind of superegoic pressure that you've never done enough, but also this is another thing. So I'm getting a little close to my own crypt of unconscious trauma, but my mom used to give me, most people know what these are, tracts. So they would like have Bible lessons on them. And she would send me into the men's room because she couldn't go in there. And she'd say, put these on every toilet seat. And so that was, so there's this incredible proselytizing, right? Like you have to invade even the bathroom with the good news, right? Quote unquote good news. So I think that's very similar, right? Like there's no space that's not able to be made into a space that can be used for proselytizing. So I think that's a big part of it.
I think and it's also interesting to think about it in like, the way, like you were saying, the form and content. The form is the same, content's different, and that's a real eye opener there. So one more like big question that I got is I have a friend, and a collaborator. He's actually a teacher a guest teacher in the Science of Logic course, and he's like a super Girardian. Like he's like a bit like he's like a super Girard nerd. I've been to his house. He's got like a bookshelf. He's got everything Girard's ever written and like a whole bunch of stuff, right? Yeah. But when I was talking to him about your book, he was saying you got to ask him about Girard. You got to ask him about the link between the obstacle, the fantasy obstacle of the racial other, and the sacrificial ritual. That there's like in Girard, there's this type of sacrificial violence that everything's built around projecting the internal conflict externally into a scapegoating ritual. Yep. So like, I don't know if you've read Girard, but just get your comment on if you have, or if you've thought about that, what's the connection maybe?
Yeah. I've read Girard, and I think that that's right. Like, I think that there's, the only thing I would say is the reason why I didn't bring him up in this book is because I don't know that in the case of racism that the external ritual has a cleansing effect, right? Like it only adds fuel to the fire, right? Like it doesn't eliminate, like Girard's whole point is that through the sacrificial ritual, that's how violence gets eliminated, right? But what's interesting is that through the way the racist fantasy is structured, even though there are sacrificial rituals like lynching, whatever, police violence today, there's no interruption of the everyday violence. So I think I'm not sure that there's really an idea of some sort of catharsis in Girard, I think, and I don't necessarily see that. Like I see that it just feeds the demand for more rather than assuaging it in some way. Like
that Girard's theory might describe a structure but not approach a way to resolve it or
to transform, get the psychic resonance of that structure, right? Like I think he's certainly empirically right about the way these structures work, but I don't think sacrifice puts an end to violence. Like I think it fuels more violence. I guess that's how I would see it, right? Like that there's more. Like sacrifice there's a certain structural necessity to it, but I also
Girard calls that pagan. Like that's pagan. So like here's the idea as far as I understand is like the externalization of the violence in like a lynching or something like that is like a pagan ritual of enjoyment, I suppose. And then Girard's thesis was that Christianity changes the relationship to the scapegoat by internalizing it. So like at least in like the figure of Jesus, like the figure of Jesus is right. is like the victim is the Christ figure, like that.
Right, but isn't his idea that the social order forms like it through some kind of act of sacrifice, whether internal or external? Like the social order forms its bond and then avoids, like that's how it gets out of this cycle of violence, right? Like, isn't that his point? Like the whole point of sacrifice is to get out of the cycle of violence.
Yeah, but then he said that's how pagan societies did it. But then they realized that wasn't a permanent solution, and that the more complex society becomes, the less a scapegoat victim is believable. Like the less there's a possibility. Like for example, like maybe there was a time in the United States where they thought the lynchings was going to be a cathartic activity that helped the community, but it's less and less believable. Like no one believes that anymore.
Do you think
like,
that's true?
I don't know. Like that. I mean, that's the idea in Girard is that it's harder to identify. It becomes more and more difficult to justify a certain universal scapegoat. I think that's the idea.
Yeah, but what about the police shootings? Like, it seems like that isn't that functioning in exactly the same way that the lynching function?
Right. Like, so, I mean, I think it still manifests. It's just easier to critique, like potentially because we're very, like critical.
Yeah, I guess. So then it's disavowed, I guess, right? Like that would be the way I would say it, right? Like that there's much more opportunity, and I think this is true about Christianity relative to pagan society, that there's much more opportunity to disavow that there's a scapegoat at work, right? Even though there still is. Right?
Yeah. I mean, certainly, like, so, and again, I'm not an expert.
I don't know. I just always had this idea in Girard that there was a sense of catharsis from violence.
There is.
And sacrifice. Right.
Yeah,
I guess that's my hope. That's the reason. The only reason why I didn't talk about Girard in this book is because of that. Because I don't think that racist violence leads to catharsis. I just don't think it does. Like, I think it leads to more racist violence.
Like the Rodney King situation.
Yeah, it doesn't. There's no like, let's all get along. It doesn't happen, right? There's just more.
Okay. I mean, I guess I'm not the right person to defend Girard, to be honest, because I just wanted to bring it up to see what connections there were. How I understand it is like there's this externalization of a scapegoat, then in like, and at least in Girard's thesis, there's this, at least for a certain type of Girard, like Christianity has a special place because they're the story that figured out the reversal of the scapegoat.
Gotcha. Right.
And then I'm not sure how, like, but then I do know for a fact that later in Girard's career, he disavowed the idea that Christianity was a point of view that allowed him to escape mimesis as such. Like that he couldn't think mimesis within Christianity. Like that he has to think about desire and conflicts of desire beyond just the sort of Christianity being a privileged point in the system or something.
Right.
And I think I actually think I read an article by Daniel Tutt where Daniel Tutt was saying his criticism of Girard is that Girard, as opposed to like say Freud or Marx, that Freud and Marx allow us to think the positivity of conflict or the positivity of mimetic desire, as opposed to just seeing it as the potential for scapegoating.
Right. Although I don't think Freud thinks of desire as mimetic. I mean, Lacan certainly does. Right? Like our desire is the desire of the other isn't a mimetic theory of desire, right? Because Lacan even says in Seminar 6, desire is interpretation, right? So like the point is that you're interpreting the other's desire and missing it. And that's how you form your desire. Like if it was really mimetic, it wouldn't even be desire for Lacan. So I think there's even a more substantive difference between Girard and psychoanalysis than just what Tutt's point is.
Okay. Could you go into that? Could you expand on that a little bit? I think that's a very important point.
Yeah. So and I think it comes back to this objet op thing that we were talking about earlier, right? So for Lacan, so he says our desire is the desire of the other, right? And that seems like that's a mimetic theory of desire if you just hear it. But his idea is that the point is that the other's desire is unknown both to us and to the other. It's because it's unconscious, right? So we have to unconsciously interpret that desire. And when we do, we always miss it because the other doesn't even know what it is. We don't know what it is. We get it wrong. And it's through the way in which we get it wrong that our desire forms. So it's very, I think it's a theory of desire that's very anti-mimetic. It's also anti-Hegelian, right? Because for Hegel, desire is the desire for recognition. And Lacan's point is, no, actually what we desire is this impossible point where recognition fails, right? So it's very, I think he's probably best, Lacan, on the way that he theorizes desire in a very way that distinguishes him from both Hegel and from Girard. It seems to me, and I think it's that for me is the most interesting part of his thinking.
It would be interesting to hear a conversation between you and Zizek on that point of desire is the impossible point where recognition fails. Because what's your opinion on Zizek always criticizes the liberal Hegelianism, which is sort of like this, which he says, I think it's like he's reducing Hegel to dialectics of recognition. Yeah.
I'm completely on his side on it.
Okay.
Completely on his side. Yeah.
Okay.
So he in fact, I told him I told him this joke, because the point is that these liberal Hegelians, that they basically reduce Hegel to Kant in a certain way, right? He's like an advanced Kantian. And so the joke goes like, it's a very short joke. I tried to read Hegel, but I found out that I can't, right? And so the joke is, it's funny because, I mean, I think it's funny anyway, but it correctly apprehends the way the liberal Hegelians approach Hegel. They Kantianize him, and they also turn him into a philosopher of recognition, which I think is so bizarre, because the whole point of the dialectic of master and servant is recognition fails. Like, that's Hegel's whole entire point. And then Robert Brandom writes an 800-page book about how the entire phenomenology is really the story of successful recognition. It seems bizarre.
Yeah,
it's a great book, though. It's a great book to read. But
right, Robert Brandom's
book, yeah. It's called A Spirit of Distrust.
Spirit of Distrust.
No,
or Spirit of Trust.
I know. That
was
funny.
The slip.
That was a funny slip, yeah.
Yeah, so Spirit of Trust, right? Yeah.
Spirit of Trust, okay. Yeah, sorry.
All right. So this is a sort of a thing I want to do. I thought it would be fun at the end of the conversation just to sort of put your thesis to the test there of the racist fantasy, to see how pervasive it is. I looked up different sites published the most viewed categories of pornography in online, and I just wanted to see how many of the categories might have this obstacle enjoyment function, and potentially so like the more fundamental is the obstacle, right? Like, and then the racist other is less fundamental but can potentially become is that correct?
Absolutely
yeah
correct.
Okay, yeah. So here are the top categories, and then I think it would just be fun to think about like what the obstacle might be here. Is the first category by far for a long time now is lesbian.
Really?
So, yeah. In the Americas, in Australia.
That seems easy, doesn't it? Well, it could be that it's. Do we know who's watching it? It could just be lesbians watching it.
Well, women are definitely searching that, but I think also men as well.
Okay.
Especially if it's the most viewed.
All right.
There have to be men watching.
Let's have a little ground rule. So we're gonna assume that it's straight guys watching this, right? So.
Yeah, that's the flaw of these lists, is that you don't have the only demographics I saw is that United States is by far the most porn watching country in the world. By far. It's not close. So congratulations.
Yeah, that's good. But let's just do that, because I think it would make this exercise a little, otherwise it's going to be infinite. But so I think there isn't the obstacle interesting, because there it's the sexual desire of the person involved, right? Like there it attaches this fantasy of like, I could convert this person to becoming hetero. I think Like, like
I was thinking something like the full sexual enjoyment beyond the phallus. Like we don't need the phallus to enjoy. Like the phallus is the obstacle to the full enjoy. If we could just get rid of the phallus, then we could get the full enjoyment. And
perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. That's much better than mine. Good. Yeah.
That's my.
You're better at this game.
I thought it was reflecting. My first, like when I was playing with this, I was like maybe like I was playing with like the libidinal and the political. Like maybe like there's a relationship between the politics of like, let's say, anti-patriarchal society and then lesbian porn. It's like we get rid of the
phallus. No, I like that. Yeah.
Okay, so the next one, this is sweeping apparently Northeast Asia, is hentai.
I have no idea what that is.
Hentai is like anime porn. It's like cartoon porn.
Oh.
And I have ideas about this, but I'd be interested to know what your first reaction is.
Your ideas seem better than mine, but let me that's animated porn.
Called it now. Apparently, you're not into hentai. Apparently, you don't know what's going on in Northeast.
I do not know. No. I've seen Miyazaki. That's about as close as I get to anime.
I was thinking if we could just get rid of physical reality.
There you go. So
like so physical reality is like physical reality is the obstacle. Like if we could just get rid of it and just have pure virtual characters.
Yeah, that's great. Totally agree. Yeah.
Apparently, in China, Japanese. Now this is a big one because I think it maybe fits with the racist other.
I think it does. Right. Like so. I think it's interesting because this is not one that I think it's almost symmetrical, right? Like there's anti-Japanese racism in China and there's anti-Chinese racism in Japan. I think I don't know if they're relatively equal, but I think they are. So yeah, that seems to fit perfectly, right? Like this is a figure of the obstacle to my enjoyment. That's who I'm getting off on. Yeah.
In Brazil, the biggest category this year is transgender.
Well, there again, I think that it's the fantasy of getting beyond gender category, right? Like I can enjoy, we get this perfect enjoyment beyond.
Like in Latin culture too, they have very like strong like sexual difference, like the man and the woman, like a traditional ideas of man and woman.
Yeah.
So like if we could just get beyond that to the transgender form,
that would make sense why it would be. So it'd be in Brazil and then in like Mississippi or something, right? So that would
right. And then the biggest one in United States is they grouped it as ebony or black.
Oh, well, that fits perfectly with.
That fits in your thesis, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot. I think there's a lot of. I just know when I was in college, there's a lot of porn where where there's black men and white women. And I think it's marketed to white men, right? Like, I think it totally plays on that racist fantasy for sure.
Well, I think you gave in a talk an example of Malcolm X and like,
oh yeah.
Did you go into that story a little bit?
Yeah. So this is from the autobiography and he tells a story when he was working as a pimp in Harlem. And he said he would have white guys come in and they would pay for the prostitute and they would pay to have a black man have sex with a white prostitute while they masturbated to them having sex. So it's pretty, and Malcolm X's conclusion is this is how perverted whiteness has become. And okay, I don't disagree with that, but it also, I think, is a more general way that the racist fantasy works in terms of sexuality. I think it's interesting that you're talking about porn because I think sexuality is one of those areas where it's easier to hide your racist fantasy in your daily life, right? It only crops up at certain times. But I think in sexuality, people feel free to let it go, especially porn viewing. So I think it's important that you brought that up because theoretically, no one else is watching you do it, right? So you can feel free from the censorship. Yeah.
Well, the other's gaze or anything.
Yeah, the censorship, right, of the other. Yeah.
Okay, let's see if there's it's funny. There's some funny categories. Like there's some people. I guess it's like I think it's like most general is again this obstacle. Like there's some funny ones. Like there's this challenge porn. Like try not to come. Like this is a high category. Like it's a challenge. Like how long can you stay with the obstacle?
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I think people do. I mean, that's like, it reminds me of that American Pie. American Pie 2, I think the guy was into Tantra, and he would try to, like, his whole point was not having an orgasm ever. So yeah.
There are some really strange one. I remember watching. Now this is a very obscure fetish, I suppose, but I remember listening to this podcast where there were people who got off on quicksand and saving people from quicksand. Like, wow. But it was like a like you're being saved from the quicksand, and the other person's pulling you out, and like that this was anyway. But there's all sorts of things that people can eroticize, right? Like it's just like this
anything can be eroticized, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's like this obstacle, right? And then so I guess one of the last questions I wanted to ask you is like the political consequences of your work is like we're not trying to like necessarily moralize. But, like trying to understand the psychological roots, which are not just capable to be resolved through traditional education and, let's say, activist work. Like, what is the consequences of your work on this level?
Yeah, that's the point. Like to hopefully to change the way that we think about race, the problem of racism, and to change the way in which we address it, which would include discussions like the one we just had about like the way in which racism is part of the sexual, it's tied to the sexual, the way in which racism is the certain racist fantasy is structured, like how the National Football League hires coaches, right? Like that, all these, like to think about these things not just as problems of representation or problems of education, but instead problems of enjoyment. And I think just that shift and problems of fantasy, and just that shift, I think it would change the way in which we took on this question.
I mean, one of the things I'm doing, there's a few channels which are quite good because they're really connected to personal social experiments, is like people who are involved in what are called kink communities. Mm-hmm. And kink communities, and so like from what I've studied, the kink communities is like, they'll get together, there are these conventions where people have different identities, and I think like they're kind of like the identity and difference, because like they're really playful with identity. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, I'm like this character, or like like the anime stuff, like they get dressed up and stuff like that, and they play with it. So if we think of racism, or if we think about sexuality, probably even on a deeper level, as this problem of enjoyment, this problem of fantasy, what do you think about things like kink communities and stuff like that? Do you know much about that?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay, wrong person to ask. But I thought it was interesting. I think maybe it's also like something politically quite
yeah, that seems good to me. Yeah.
So, like the communities actually seem quite like wholesome as well. Like it's not like it's almost like they've confronted their inner monsters, and then they've like turned them into fantasy characters and stuff like that.
Yeah, that seems good. Yeah. I mean, I think anything that, I think one of the things is to think about, I think the more that we can think about form and not be blinded by content, I think that's a big part of like how to respond to the question of racism.
All right. So then from that vantage point, thinking about form, and I think that could be a good takeaway for viewers in general of our conversation, this form and content relation, is enjoyment left and right, problem of enjoyment, and United States with, say, Trump on the one hand, or alt-right on the one hand, let's say, and let's say the woke left on the other hand. What's your libidinal fantasy analysis of this political dimension?
Yeah, well, I mean, like on the one hand, like on the MAGA right, it's clear that the enjoyment depends upon some enemy, right? Like immigrants that are trying to invade. I know one of the ways that people talk about it now is Biden shouldn't be worried about the border between Russia and Ukraine. He should be worried about the border between Mexico and the United States. So the sense that we're under assault and that's the libidinal charge. Whereas I think that the what I would call the superegoic left, just because that's how I would think of it, the moralistic left. I don't even think it's a left, but it's this focus on the libidinal charge has been taken, is not universal. Instead, it derives from the superegoic pressure. That, like we talked about with the person who feels like I have to eradicate this one racist idea every day. And I think that like anytime you succumb to that, there's a tremendous enjoyment in succumbing to the superego, but there's also, as you point out, there's this unending quality to it. So you never fully get to the position. And also it's completely isolated and particularist. So there's, I think, on both sides, a refusal of any universal egalitarian struggle, which is what I think anti-racism ultimately has to be.
Right. Okay. And then that also couples to sort of capitalist modernity and potentially emancipatory projects.
Yeah.
So our first discussion was your book, Emancipation After Hegel. Then in the last 3 years, you released Universality and Identity Politics, Enjoyment Left and Right, and the Racist Fantasy. Is there anything that you would like to share with the viewers about these the series of books that you've been putting out that you haven't already had a chance to speak about?
No, I think we've talked them through. I think
okay,
we're pretty good. Yeah.
All right. So anything else people should know about your work? LAC conference coming up? Anything that people should get involved with?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I have this little podcast, Why Theory, that.
Why Theory? Okay.
Yeah. All
right. I'll link to Why Theory in the description, as well as the Racist Fantasy that we discussed today. And other than that, just thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, I really appreciate you having me. Thanks. It was great.
Okay. Have a great day.
Care. Okay. You too.